In this video, we are going to start building our mini LBO model from a completely blank template. The goal here is not to create a perfect institutional grade LBO. It is to understand how capital actually flows through a lower middle market transaction. In this first walkthrough, we will focus on just two things. First, the transaction assumption, and second, the sources and uses of cash at close. Everything else, projections, debt paydown, and returns will build off of this foundation. Before we put in any numbers, it is important to understand what this section represents conceptually. The transaction assumptions define the economic reality of the deal. How much are we paying, how it is financed, and how the purchase price is allocated between cash, rollover equity, and contingent consideration. If you get this wrong, every output downstream, the IRR, the MOIC, the leverage, will be wrong, even if your formulas are perfect. I also want to be very clear on where we are in the process. At this stage, these assumptions are intentionally high level. This is the work you do before putting together an investment memo, which we will cover in Module 2.4, and before deciding whether it makes sense to proceed and submit an IOI, which we will cover in Module 3. Let's start with the valuation. So I'm going to begin by entering the trailing 12 months EBITDA, which in this example is $2.5 million, and derived from the financial data provided by the banker via the SIM. So I'm typing in 2.5 million. Next, we will assume an entry EBITDA multiple of 8 times. This assumption is based on some preliminary analysis of the industry sector and discussions with partners in the firm who have sector expertise, and by looking at some of the recent transaction comps using company CRM resources. This, however, is subject to further refinement as we continue with diligence down the road, but for this example, this is the assumption that is being made. So I type in the entry EBITDA multiple here, 8 times. Once those two inputs are in, the model calculates the total enterprise value, which comes out at $20 million. This is the headline value of the business before we think about structure, rollover equity, or earnouts. Importantly, this $20 million represents the enterprise value. It includes the cash paid out at close, rollover equity, and earnouts, but it does not mean all $20 million is paid out in cash. I will also plug in an exit multiple of 8 times. For now, this is simply an assumption that exit multiple is the same as the entry multiple. We are not yet assuming any type of multiple expansion at this stage. We will revisit exit dynamics later once we understand where value creation is actually coming from. So for now, I type in 8 times multiple. And then for the transaction fees, we will enter transaction related costs. I will assume $140,000 of financing fees and $280,000 of transaction fees. So $140,000 and $280,000. So even though these numbers are looking small, in lower middle market deals, they do matter, especially when equity checks are tight. Now we are going to move into the capital structure, but I want to be very intentional about the order in which we do this. Before we talk about debt and equity, we start with how the purchase price itself is structured based on diligence. So based on our initial review of the SIM and preliminary discussions with the banker, we are assuming that the $20 million purchase price breaks down as follows: 60% cash at close, 20% seller rollover equity, and 20% earnout. So let's start with the seller rollover. So from the SIM and the early diligence, there appears to be a key man dependency on the founder. Because of that, we believe a 20% rollover equity is appropriate. This is not just a negotiation lever, it's a risk management tool to ensure alignment post-close. So I'm entering 20%. Once I input that percentage, the model automatically calculates the dollar amount, which is just over $4 million. Remember, we are not paying cash for the rollover equity of the earnout. They are part of the enterprise value, but they're not cash users at close. So next is the earnout, also set at 20% of enterprise value. So I enter the earnout at 20% here. This is driven by two factors. First, the same key man dependency we just discussed. Second, when you look at the last 3 years of historical, there appears to be noticeable revenue volatility. We will review this in more detail when we walk through the P&L in the next module. So given those risks, we believe 20% of the purchase price should be contingent, structured as a 2-year earnout. This earnout is contingent consideration. It increases enterprise value, but it does not appear in the sources and uses because no cash changes hands at close. Once the rollover equity and the earnouts are defined, cash at close becomes a residual. So in this case, cash at close is 60% of the enterprise value, or approximately $12.3 million. This sequencing reflects how real deals are structured. Risk first, financing second. Now that we know that the cash at close is $12.3 million, we're going to start by looking at leverage, not equity. In this example, we're assuming that 60% of the cash portion of the purchase price is funded with debt. We then break that debt into two layers, 45% senior debt and 15% subordinated debt. So putting 45% here and then 15% here. Once those assumptions are in, the model automatically calculates approximately $5.5 million of senior debt and $1.8 million of subordinated debt. You will also see that the percentage of enterprise value and EBITDA leverage multiples auto-populate. These leverage levels are intentionally conservative for this example, but they can be materially higher depending on the sector, cash flow durability, and the lender appetite. With the debt defined, investor equity becomes a residual. The model now calculates investor equity at 40% of cash at close, or approximately $4.9 million. This represents the capital contributed by the sponsor and the LPs to complete the transaction. Before we move on, I want to walk through the sources and uses line by line so you understand exactly where each input is coming from in the model. This table is not about assumptions, it is about linkages. So starting on the sources side, every line item here is pulled directly from the capital structure section above. The investor equity of about $4.9 million is linked directly from the investor equity at close line. We are not manually entering this. Is the residual equity required once debt, rollover, and earnouts are defined. Senior debt of approximately $5.5 million is also directly linked from the senior debt line in the capital structure. Subordinated debt of $1.8 million is also pulled directly from the subordinated debt percentage of the capital structure. And the rollover equity of $4.1 million is linked directly from the seller rollover line. Even though rollover equity is not cash, it is still a source of capital as we go into the transaction. Now let us walk through the user side where that capital is allocated. The equity purchase price is adjusted for transaction fees and financing fees. Those fees are pulled directly from the transaction assumptions section, and the adjustment happens automatically in the model. You will notice that the equity purchase price here is lower than the $20 million headline value. That is because rollover equity and earnouts reduce the cash we need at close, even though they are still part of total enterprise value. For the refinancing of the existing debt in this example, we are assuming that there is no existing debt at close, so this line item is zero. In more complex models, any existing debt should be refinanced at close and appear as a use of funds. Once all of these line items are properly linked, total sources use equals total uses. This is not just a formatting check. It is confirmation that the transaction is internally consistent. If the sources don't equal uses, the deal does not work regardless of how good the returns look. This completes the transaction setup for our mini LBO. One last important point. This is a generic example using simplified assumptions purely for illustration. We will apply both the qualitative framework from Model 2.2 and this mini LBO approach to a real case study, Procare Health, in Model 2.5. In the next video, we will build the P&L projections and discuss the growth and margin assumptions for this business and how those feed into the rest of the model. The key takeaway here is simple. Returns are driven by structure and risk management long before they're driven by leverage or Excel mechanics.